Hello everyone and welcome to the Constructive Criticism Network. This network is here to help you improve at Magic the Gathering at every level. From Pauper Leagues to Top 1000 Mythic, we've got you covered. If you want to hear the entire network, head on over to our sponsor at puremtgo.com, where you can hear each and every show, each and every week, and check out their sponsor, MTGO Traders, and tell them that the CCMTG Network sent you. Now sit back, enjoy the show. From YouTube, podcasts, and more, here's this week's episode from ConstructiveCriticism.com. Hello everyone, and welcome to episode 33 of Arena Mythic Cast. I'm your host, Spencer, and I'm joined by a very, very special guest. We're joined by Mikaela Downs. Mikaela, how's it going?
Hey, I'm doing well. How are you doing today?
I'm doing really well. You are not the typical guest that we have on this podcast, and the reason for that is because usually I'm inviting people on the show that are had just gotten Mythic. They want to talk about an individual deck, stuff like that. And, the kind of the future of this show as it returns. So welcome back, everybody. It's been since June since we did this podcast last. But, I've decided on kind of a new approach to this podcast. I had kind of talked about that before the show went on hiatus about wanting to focus on all of the arena formats, limited and constructed and historic, and, doing more of that stuff. And when thinking about coming back for this show, I thought, I would really like a co-host. As much as I love and will still continue to invite Mythic players on to talk about their experience getting Mythic, talk about how they're going to prepare for the qualifier or players who qualified, I also want somebody to bounce ideas off of and to create the show together. And when I posted about that, Mikaela had probably the best message of anyone who was interested. I was in bed and I showed my wife. I was like, "Oh my gosh, this message is amazing! Like this is the best of everybody who responded." Mikaela, you really stood out. Mikaela, can I talk about you for a second and just some of a little bit about you? You're a two-time Pro Tour competitor. You are
Correct.
a Magic streamer. I've actually had a chance to check out your stream. You're a mom of a little one. Married to team captain of, I don't know how to say it. Is it Swagu or?
Swagoy.
Swagoy.
Yeah.
Swagoy. What is your husband's name?
He goes by Tom Locke on the
Tom
internet.
Locke. Awesome. And you just overall Magic content creator. You being a parent, you being, married and having some of the same type of life experiences that I had really made it appealing for me to invite you on and just see if we could mesh. But I'm so excited to have you. Do you want to tell the listeners anything else about yourself?
You covered a lot of it. I'm very excited to be here. I love to talk about Magic. I love to talk about competitive Magic. Arena is something that brought me back into Magic early last year, and I really enjoy the game, and it's definitely it's exciting to be here with this podcast as it evolves, as Arena also evolves in the formats that they offer.
Yeah, and the thing is, Mikaela, and this, the listeners don't know, and some of the listeners are people that were interested in joining me as co-host, but I've actually decided not to talk to any more people about doing this. I have a belief that when you find somebody that is a great candidate for a position and that you want to work with, you don't send them on their way and get back to them because, they could change their mind. And I don't want Mikaela to change her mind. So Mikaela has actually agreed to actually become my co-host. And I'm so stoked, Mikaela. I know I told you this before the show, but I've never worked with somebody that is excited and ready to go and wanting to be a part of the process in the ways that I need as you have been just for this episode. And I'm really grateful for that. So thank you.
I'm excited to be here, and I'm excited for this episode. I'm excited for future episodes and just to talk about Magic.
Yeah, me too. Let's get into that. Before we do, though, just want to mention our sponsor really quick over at MTGO, puremtgo.com. They host tons of free content, and you can check out their sponsor at mtgotraders.com and let them know that the CCMTG Network and Mythic Cast sent you. With that being said, this week's topic is pretty big. We're doing, on constructive criticism, we used to do a segment called Power Rankings, where we would take the decks and give them points according to their finish across SEGs or GPs or Magic Online events, things like that. And it is really hard to get like a culmination of events and give them points, Mikaela. We're in this whole new world.
We're back to, honestly, the bans were great last time, and we're back to the world that people love to be in for Magic, where it's just every week's evolving. There's different decks. You're making metagame calls. You're trying to get that perfect 75, just picking the right card for the meta. It's amazing.
Yeah, I think that instead of giving decks points according to finish, Mikaela and I have decided this week to kind of break down just the macro archetypes of the formats and kind of what you can expect from them. And even within those, Mikaela, I think we both think that there is quite a few differences in some of these macro archetypes.
Oh, absolutely. And I'm really excited to dive into some of those differences and just, chat about card choices and, how those could change from week to week.
Yeah. I think that, like you said, the format is super open. You actually have some notes in here that I found really interesting, but one of the things I want to talk about is before we dive into the individual archetypes, it's kind of just what a open format kind of means. Does that, I don't know about you, Mikaela, but when in an open format, I get really hyped to think, what are people going to play this week? And how can I attack that? And that metagame within the metagame and that decision is really fun, I find. I think that's why a lot of people really enjoy things like Modern.
Oh, absolutely. Modern doesn't, I'd say pretty often doesn't have tons of huge changes with set releases. You might get a couple of cool cards added, but as far as archetypes go, to my knowledge, it doesn't change drastically for the most part. There are exceptions, obviously. And so, yeah, we're kind of looking at a point in standard where you get that experience that maybe we haven't had as much of in the last year, where we've really just had these very, very dominant decks.
Yeah. With that being said, let's get into these top decks. So I actually didn't realize that I had these in the wrong order for total metagame percentage from when I pulled them. But let's start from the lowest percent. I know that's the opposite of how we put them. But coming in at the lowest percent, which was approximately around 6% when I last looked. I haven't looked this morning. I know that Goldfish gets updated and things like that. But we actually have Teamer Ramp. So this is the Lotus Cobra ramp deck with Genesis Ultimatum. And for those who have listened to my podcast for a long time, I don't know if you know this, Mikaela, but I'm a huge Lotus Cobra fan. It's actually my favorite Magic card of all time. And when they did the early access event, I only streamed Lotus Cobra decks. That was it. That was my only rule. I was like, I don't care about anything else. I just want to play Lotus Cobra because I love the card. It's literally just my favorite Magic card. I'm gonna be honest. This deck, I've been trying to get trophies with every deck, preparing for this podcast. And when I got my trophy for this deck, I immediately text my friend Mason Clark, he's the host of Constructive Criticism, and just said, I'm really sad because I don't think this deck is very good. It's powerful. You obviously can win with it, but I was pretty sad. I was like, this is not it, fam. I think its biggest problem, and please speak to this, is I think it's a bad Gruul matchup.
Oh, for sure. You get so punished just by stumbling with this deck versus Gruul. I know you have some early answers with Scorching Dragonfire. I guess you can throw a Lotus Cobra in front of something if you really have to.
You do, though. You have to.
But, Gruul, they play... oh my... See, now I'm going to blank on a card name.
That's okay. It happens. That's just podcasting 101. You just blank on card names all the time.
And apparently this Gruul deck's not even playing it, so I can't even use an example. The 1 damage spell.
Oh, Spike Feet Hazard.
Spike, yes. Thank you. So yeah, that card's a huge problem for obviously Lotus Cobras, where it just kills it right away.
Yeah,
and
the Mythic land also, right? Just being able to Like let's say you're playing the 3 mana, the Elvish, whether you're playing Elvish Visionary or Solemn Simulacrum, or it's not Elvish Visionary, is it? What is the name of that card?
I think it is Elvish Visionary.
Isn't Elvish Visionary the 2 mana one? See, now I'm blanking. Either way, it's not that hard for...
It's Llanowar Visionary. It's
Llanowar Visionary.
Llanowar Elves and Elvish Visionary.
Got it.
That's what it is.
There we go. But no, it's so easy for them to pick off 2 of your creatures with that land as well, and they're just playing it as a land. In addition to the fact that Embercleave is quite good against you, you really need an early ultimatum to win that matchup. And spoiler alert, Gruul is the best deck in this format right now. We see that across the last 2 weeks, across multiple events, and it puts this deck that is very powerful into kind of a rough spot, right? Where you have to believe that Gruul is going to fall out of the winner's metagame, I think, to pick this up. But I don't know. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, so this was actually a deck that I played fairly early on when I was looking at the new format, and I had those draws where you're just like, this deck is powerful. The ceiling is so high on it. Like, sometimes you just Genesis Ultimatum, hit like an Ugin, like 2 Terror of the Peaks, and a Beanstalk Giant, and you're loving your life. And then other times, you're staring down a Gruul deck that's on the play and has everything, and your lands are coming to play tapped, and or you're missing a color of mana.
Right. Oh man, really and the fact that you're only basically playing blue for Mimic and Ultimatum is just, it just makes you, and you need triple blue. It is interesting mana, to say the least.
Yeah.
The thing is, though, is Mimic is actually sick. When I saw that innovation, the number of times where you can just play it as a Lotus Cobra in a turn and then just pop off, or it comes into play as another tear, or whatever. Like, that card is sick innovation for that deck.
Oh yeah, it's awesome that you do have the flexibility of it being the creature. Usually when you need it to be a creature, sometimes I need to be a creature and I didn't have another creature to solve that problem. Or just hitting the land drop can be so relevant in this deck too. Like, just getting to that 7th mana.
Yeah, it does help that it gets to be your blue mana in addition. Like I said, you need that triple blue, so that certainly helps. I have a kind of a question for you. I don't know if I've played this deck, obviously to get the trophy, and then a few other times. I'd say around, I don't know, like 20 matches with the deck. One thing that I have kind of interesting thoughts around is trying to decide what escape cards to play in this deck. I still like Chainweb, but I actually really like Ox in this deck. Is kind of something I've seen people doing now as well. What are your thoughts on the type of escape cards you want in this deck? The deck already does have a pretty good blue-black matchup, so it's possible that you can get away with cutting a few, but I just want to know your thoughts.
I think Ox is the more powerful escape card right now. In this deck particularly, sometimes you do get down to the, you're down to no cards in hand, you've used all your resources, so being able to bring back an Ox is pretty powerful, but I haven't really been able to play it up against the Rogues matchup where you're really going to want those cards, so a little harder for me to say. I'd say Ox is the stronger escape card versus Arcaneer. But
I know that you are a fan of mono red decks. Am I misreading your notes? I could be misreading.
I believe that says my personal least favorite deck.
Oh, I definitely am misreading. That's gas. Okay, so you're not a fan of mono red. I actually think this deck has a really good mono red matchup, and I wanted to call that out. That you go from one of the aggressive decks in Gruul, where you have this really rough matchup because the creatures are really large, they're really hard to deal with, to this deck where the creatures are extremely small and fragile, and they honestly don't put enough big pressure on you. Like, you're okay in this deck taking chip damage, blocking with a Visionary, or blocking with a Solemn, or kind of whatever. That it puts it's really interesting that you would go, well, if mono red's good and is the best aggro deck, like I'm happy playing Teamer, but if Gruul is, it's a little bit rougher. And our next deck to talk about is mono red. And it's funny that you say that because in preparing for this, I was texting a friend and I said I think mono red is like unplayable right now. I am so surprised that it made this list. I don't know what its good matchups are in this format.
I think it does actually have game versus rogues. It has a lot of good removal answers to the rogues deck, and yeah, it can go under rogues, which is
that makes a lot of sense actually. Just being able to, I mean, they're trading 2 mana removal for 1 mana creatures. That's really rough on their tempo. For a tempo deck, that makes a ton of sense.
Yeah, and so yeah, being able to go under rogues is relevant. It can go under the Yorion decks to some extent. I don't have a lot of experience with that specific matchup because it's not a huge part of the meta, but I think you also just have a lot of people who just really enjoy playing mono red, and without Uro holding it back, it's definitely a lot more viable than it's been in the last couple months.
I do know that Sandy Dog did well with it yesterday. We'll see how he finishes, but that's Sandy Dog, right? Like, so it's hard when mono red champions are so good with mono red that it's hard for me to decipher where the deck sits often. I had not thought about rogues in where mono red would get its edge, but that does make a lot of sense.
I believe it is also favorable versus Rakdos. Obviously, a Crocus on the board does become a problem, but that can be a little bit slow for the Rakdos deck to set up.
Sure. That makes some sense.
And I know Rakdos does have some mana issue. You have a lot of comes into play tapped lands that can slow the deck down and just mess with your curve a little bit.
I do like the innovation. I know that early on, after the bannings, people weren't playing Phoenix Main, that now they're playing Phoenix Main, and I actually do think that helps the deck a lot in putting reoccurring threat of damage that's hard to deal with in play. It's pretty big for that deck. Something that I think that hard to deal with permanents that deal damage. It was starting to kind of lose that as you lost its really powerful 3-drops from the last couple years. So I've been mostly impressed with that. Have you gotten the chance to play this deck at all in the last couple weeks?
I played it in best of 1.
Sure.
And I went 3-0 with mono red at best of 1.
Sure.
But that's a little bit more to be expected. Yeah, it plays like a mono. It plays pretty much like a mono red deck has played within the last year. You don't have the reach that you had a year ago, or I guess a little bit over a year ago with the Experimental Frenzy plus Steamkin combination. Actually, that would have been standard over the summer, but Uro, mono red's was just irrelevant when Uro was the thing. Yeah. So yeah, you don't have that reach, but Embercleave is still just a very powerful card, and mono red can be more than aggressive enough to get that cleave out early and put a lot of pressure.
I do like that mono red has pretty great access to, just kind of different spell lands. I know that I'm looking at a list now that was playing Kazul's Fury. I know that people have played Spike Feed Hazard. I know people have played the Mythic one. So it certainly has I don't know the word inevitability or staying power is what I'm looking for here, but the ability to not miss its land drops and be a monocolored deck in a format where people are playing tap lands. Like the people are playing quite a few tap lands, and that does give mono red a push. So,
yep, and so I know like the bad matchups for this deck are going to be your Gruels, your mono greens. Not having a quick enough draw versus the more the Yorion and slightly slower decks.
So the Jacob Wilson version of Yorion is the one that I have the most experience with. I think I've played about 3 leagues with that. I trophied I think 2 of them. But one of the things that I noticed, like that deck stomps mono red. Like it absolutely annihilates it. And I think that when you're building a Yorion deck, and here's just kind of my initial thoughts, you have to take aggro into consideration so that you can even get to your end game. If you look at the Willie Adel approach to deck building, the number one thing he wants to do is beat aggro. Like that's the first thing he says. I have to do this in order to play this deck. And I think that Yorion, as a card and as an archetype or multiple archetypes, kind of lends itself to that. Like if I'm going to play this value game, I need to make sure that I'm not dying before I get going. And because of that, you end up seeing cards that are just really high value against this deck. I mean, Glass Casket, Charming Prince is weirdly good against this deck, even though it dies to shock. There's just lots of little things kind of add up. The number of times I've blocked with a Llanowar Visionary and been like, I cannot believe I just got that 2-for-1. I don't know, it's pretty high. Robber of the Rich, though, is just still a heck of a Magic card. Like, that card just pulls a lot of weight.
Yeah, that card's super impressive, especially when you get to be on the play and, start stealing, hopefully, a relevant spell early. Sometimes, especially from that Selesnya deck, if the Robber comes out, there's plenty of low-cost spells that the red deck very likely wants to be able to play.
Absolutely. So that came in with 8% of the meta. We covered 2 of the decks. Next up, we have Rakdos. I believe that Caroline was playing this deck for the VML. And absolutely crushed it. This is a deck that this is actually one of the 2 decks that I have, one of the 2 decks that I have not trophied with on this list. This deck, to me, reminds me of Jund, like old school Jund. And I know that's weird because it's like got a bunch of, kind of dorky creatures, but it's just a bunch of 1-for-1 and 2-for-1 removal and value. I don't know. It reminds me kind of that play style. Have you gone to play this deck at all?
I have not. I've played against it somewhat in testing, and I obviously watched Caroline go through the VML top 8 with the deck, so I am very familiar with it. I've played against it a fair amount, so I definitely understand, what the deck's doing and where the power, comes from, and at least what matters from the side of the matchup that I'm trying to play against it. And I believe I did see Kroxa referred to as Tarmogoyf, which is kind of funny when Goyfhawk is in the standard format right now.
What is Goyfhawk?
The Nighthawk Scavenger.
Oh, sure. The Tarmogoyf. I got it. That's a good name.
Yeah.
The thing is with this deck specifically, I think I've played against this deck the second most in this format. I think I played against Rogues the most, and then this is probably number 2. With every deck, this deck is very popular. I think that it's enjoyable. When I see that 8%, though, it makes me wonder, why is this only 8% of the quote-unquote winners meta on Goldfish by appearances to me, certainly not by the stuff that you see Fire Shoes posting. It just seems super popular, on ladder play, in leagues. I don't know, 8% seemed low to me.
I think it's a very strong deck. I think there's a lot of sequencing of your spells that comes into play. So it can make the learning curve on the deck fairly high. And there's a lot of aggro decks out there that it does struggle with. I wouldn't say they're massively unfavorable matchups, but, slightly unfavored. And even against the Yorion decks, I think it has shifted to people believing that the Rakdos deck has a slightly bad matchup versus a variety of Yorion decks. And I think that's because of cards like Maze Mind Tome really can, if you can get a Maze Mind Tome out, it allows you to kind of play around that discard a little bit better.
Yeah. My understanding from some friends I trust that have played this deck is this deck absolutely dunks on blue-black. Just completely destroys it.
And that is 100% the reason to be playing it. And I know that was a big decision for Caroline in the VML was, hey, I think my first round opponent's going to be on blue-black. There's a good chance there's going to be a lot of rogues. Let's play this.
Yeah. Well, I would be interested to talk to somebody with a little more expertise on this deck because I think it is popular. I think people really enjoy it. I just am not personally as familiar with it to speak to it, other than from the other side, right? From Teamer's side, or from the Yorion side, or from the some of the other green deck side. I would like to move on to Yorion. It also comes in at the time with approximately 8% of the meta, approximately 3% coming from Selesnya, around 3% coming from Esper, and around 2% coming from Azorius. This not including any versions that would be, I don't know, Jeskai or I've played against Teamer ramp decks that are really Yorion decks, things like that. So I
There's
think
Abzan running around out there too.
yeah, I've seen that too. So there's quite a few different Yorion decks, and I think both you and I have played, a couple of different versions of this. You are more familiar with the blue-white version. I'm more familiar with the green-white version. What is it about Yorion that makes it the companion that stayed the course and people are able to play?
Yorion's the companion. It's not a companion that you want to have out, like, need to have out super early in the game. It takes some setup to get to the point that you want to play a Yorion. So it's very powerful to have as a companion. And there are enough cards in the format that are strong enough that you can afford to play an 80 card deck. It's still not totally optimal, but just the power level of being able to go and grab that Yorion and possibly cast it on turn 5, depending on how the game's been going, is super, super powerful. And just guaranteeing that you have that card.
Yeah, let's actually talk about companion versus non-companions. I think that these are actually lumped together in here. There are Yorion decks that are not companion decks included within these numbers. If you're playing Yorion as a companion, you probably have the Great Henge in your green-white deck. If you're not playing it as a companion, you got 4 Yorions main. Your deck is just a ton of 4-ups, stuff like that. And I think we've even seen blue-white versions that are 60 cards. We've seen I've played against a blue-black 60 card Yorion deck. There is a lot of different ways to build with this card, which to me means that these decks have the most room to gain metagame percentage. They have the most room to tune and find ways to move forward in this very open metagame. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, absolutely. There's tons of options for cards, and then also just figuring out, like, is my version of the deck one that wants to be playing 60, or can we gain this advantage of having it in a companion slot and be okay with 80 cards? I'm personally most familiar with the blue-white Yorion version. I actually ran the list in day 1 of the MIQ last weekend that LSV had shared to Twitter. Just copy and paste that, made a couple changes to the sideboard, and I was really impressed with the deck. The version I was playing felt a little bit more on the control side rather than trying to go for that charming prince and infinite combos. I was more focused on control the board, eventually get that value off Yorion, and just make it a spot that my opponent can't come back from, and finish the game off with some Dream Trawlers.
Sure. And Dream Trawler is right now quite the card. I mean, you look at Jacob Wilson was playing 3. Is it Run Amok? I don't remember the name of the
Yes, I believe it is Run. That sounds correct.
But you have people that are like, Dream Trawler is a problem for my deck. But whether it's Cruel, whether it's Mono Green, whether it's some of the other Yorion decks, there are people that are like, man, Dream Trawler is rough. I am curious. One thing that I think that 3 colors does do is it does allow you to have more really good cards in your 80 card decks. I would be really interested to see. I know, and I think you actually had some experience with like some Bant versions or some Jeskai versions. Obviously, we have Esper is a popular Doom Foretold version of this deck. I would be interested to see if that's the direction the 80 cards go, and if the 60 cards kind of stay at 2 colors. I would not be surprised with that as an evolution to this metagame.
Yeah, and I think that makes total sense. By the way, the green card is Run Afoul.
Run Afoul.
Run Afoul. So yeah, super powerful card versus Dream Trawler. If your opponent's can't or is not aware of the need to play around that card.
It's really good against the. I don't know if you've seen like the Luca version of the deck of the Dream Trawler deck, where they're just trying to get it in really fast, where they're tapping out for Luca, so you're easily able to take that out. So
I did try that version. So I actually, as you had mentioned, I tried a couple of the different 3-color versions, and the reason I end up with a blue-white over a 3-color version was I was having a lot of issues where there's a lot of double white spells, and I wasn't necessarily hitting the double white when I needed to, which was causing me some issues versus aggro. But at the same time, the 3-color decks also had a few more answers to aggro than just a straight blue-white version did. So, give and take, I decided for spending a day playing Magic, I was going to be happier with my mana being a little bit more consistent than a 3-color deck. But I could also see these 3-color decks evolving to have a stronger, more thought-out mana base. I think that's something that 3-color decks tend to struggle with at the very beginning of a format.
Yeah, it's funny. While I do think that Gruul is the best deck in this format, and uh, if you followed my content over the last few years, you know that Gruul is just one of my favorite archetypes overall. I actually would play Green White Yorion at whatever my next event was. I think that having I don't know, it's easily the most fun I've had in this format is the green white version of this deck. So, is there a belief that you have on which of these decks is the strongest, which has the most room to move forward in this metagame?
Okay, in my what I would probably be jamming is still the blue white version personally, but
Sure.
I don't necessarily think that's the right call. It was just I end up being very, very comfortable with that version at the end of the day. And the mana base felt right to me. But we do have some data from the CFB Clash this weekend. And Esper, Doom, Yorion had an 83.3% day 2 conversion rate.
That's pretty strong.
That's very strong. And I believe there were 3 copies in the top, 4 copies in the top 16. 3 of them played Yorion.
Do you think that has to do with the Gruul decks and the mono green decks cutting down on their oh my gosh, now I'm blanked on the card name. Gem Razors?
Yeah, I think Gruul had to cut down on Gem Razors because it's not a strong card against rogues or, a lot of the big metagame cards out there, but it's such a strong card against these Esper decks where, maybe they're trying to play like a glass casket.
Right.
And yeah, sure, sometimes you can get the glass casket on Stone Coil Serpent. There's no need to kill it, but a lot of times if it's on your Love Struck Beast, then getting that card off the board is excellent,
Right.
especially with the Gem Razor where you can put a little bit more power on the board. So yeah, I could definitely see that as being part of the rise. Also, the Esper version just has a lot of good early answers to Gruul, and can really stabilize early in the game versus the deck, which is very important.
Yeah. I mean, like I said, I think that these decks have the most room to grow, and I think that's a really powerful thing in an open format. Like being able to be able to figure out what these decks need, and obviously, if we look at just the Clash event, we're already seeing that happen, right? We're already seeing people go further, take this a little bit further, and that's really awesome. So
yeah, I think it's super interesting. After we went from MPL had like a 25% win rate for like blue white Yorion last week to I see like the Azorius Blink deck was like a 72% day 2 conversion in CFB Clash, and not very many people played it either.
I think that the demise of Yorion was a little overstated on Twitter, to be fair. It was, this deck's terrible, I told you never should have played it. It's like, I don't know if terrible is the right word.
Are you saying people over-exaggerate things on Twitter?
I would never say that because that would be truthful, and you can't say true things. Okay, the next 2 decks occupy huge portions of the metagame. They are the 2 probably, well, 2 archetypes. I should not say decks. The 2 most popular macro archetypes. We have, coming in around 25%, we have blue-black, and I put slash rogues, by the way. These decks are so different from each other, list by list. It blows my mind how different. You've got Lurrus versions, you've got non-Lurrus versions, you've got some that are almost just straight up control decks. This deck has so many different ways to build it. It's really interesting. It's interesting to me. I do not have a trophy with this deck. As one of the decks on this list that I didn't get a chance to trophy with before this. I did try the Reduke version really quick, and honestly, I wonder if this deck actually needs Crab in this metagame. I don't know, Mikaela, what are your thoughts on which version's best? Which version would you play? Which version do you struggle against?
So, as a blue-white Yorion player, this matchup is not. It has a particularly good matchup versus the Yorion decks just because they are able to be aggressive. They're able to. I know milling an 80 card deck sounds crazy, but it can happen fast, surprisingly fast. And so, having the crabs versus like that version is super, super powerful. But really the most powerful card against the Yorion deck is going to be the Into the Story. I had a particular game versus the deck where I thought I had stabilized. I was really happy. And then I just kind of had a couple dead draws for a turn, and my opponent drew it Into the Story, and it was just over. So really that's the main card in Rogues that I'd say is like everyone's playing. If you're not playing it, I don't know what you're doing. It has to be Into the Story. It's just it can bring you back in games so quickly. But yeah, I think Crab is a really solid choice right now. It's very good against. It's very, very good against the Yorion decks. Not that I don't know how much more like help you need, but you know, a lot of times a late Crab, and if they just kind of slow down, can just really finish milling them out pretty quickly. And it also can act as a blocker versus the Grill decks before they get the cleave.
And mono red,
nice.
it blocking.
And,
oh my gosh, now I forgot the name of the rogue. Anyway, it blocking some of those smaller creatures.
Fervent Champion.
That too, yeah. I just think that like the body managers, and honestly, just turning on your stuff early, whether it's your Into the Story, whether it's your Drown in the Lock, just enabling your cards that care about the size of their graveyard quickly. Crab just does such a good job of that. When I was playing the Reduke version, I was like, the number of times they had 5 cards or 6 cards in the graveyard, I'm like, man, this really sucks. Like, I wish that I had, done a little bit better. And then when you do play the Crab version, you get Lotus, which just gets you a free Crab back, and that's pretty cool.
Yeah, those versions, you get to your 8 cards in your opponent's graveyard super, super fast. With Lurrus, recurring that Crab, or even just recurring one of your very relevant rogues is very good. I know they also play the Thieves Guild Enforcer, which is it's a great card to have versus aggro decks, because if you are able to mill them and get those 8 cards early, you got a really good blocker to throw down that acts as a removal spell a lot of the time too. So it's a very versatile deck. It's very strong. I know there's been a lot of decks moving to the Zero Sand version, which I think has strength versus the aggro decks.
Is that the 5 mana card?
Yes, that is it has flash, but you can also pay the 2, a blue and a black, to return an unblocked attacking rogue you control to its owner's hand and put into your play tapped and attacking. When it deals combat damage to a player, you may put target permanent card from that player's graveyard onto the battlefield in your control.
Yeah, the ninjutsu one.
Yeah, so it's really powerful, but I think it gets a little too cute for my taste. I mean, you're paying 4 mana, hoping something doesn't get blocked or removed before attacks, and I think if people are really aware of it, it's very easy to play around.
Yeah, I saw a list that was playing one of that card, just like as a gotcha. I thought that was interesting. If you do play that card, I believe you are not able to play Lurrus anymore. So it's kind of like a pick and choose. But like I said, there are a ton of ways to build this deck. It is, I don't know. I would describe this deck as a tempo control deck. You can also just make it straight up control if that's kind of the route you want to go. But it's very interesting to have a deck like this in the format. I don't know that we've seen a deck this good at tempo control or these as a tempo deck in quite a while. Like, I don't know that the blue-red deck from at the end of last season was actually very good. And this deck is quite strong, despite what I said on Twitter 2 weeks ago. So.
Yeah, I agree. The things to keep in mind with this deck is there's a lot to be aware of while you're playing the deck. You're keeping track of how many cards you have in your opponent's graveyard. One of your bad matchups is Rakdos, and Rakdos can really manipulate their graveyard and mess up that count for you very, very easily. As I found out like the first time I picked up the deck.
Yeah.
That was a hard lesson to learn, let me tell you.
It happens quick. It happens real quick. Honestly, I think that my biggest problem with this deck, and this is not a deck that I would play in a tournament personally, and my reasoning for that, Mikaela, is just people can beat this deck if they want to. Like, this is one of those decks that when they're not prepared for it, and when they have shaved cards from their sideboard or from their main deck because they think that, this deck might have a downtick, you're going to get wins. Like, you need to be prepared to this deck. It's kind of like what we were talking about, where the Yorion decks naturally have to be prepared for aggro, right? the like you in this format, this puts a check on the format. If you're not prepared for it, you're probably going to lose to it. But I think it's just too easy to decide you're not going to lose to this deck with the number of really powerful escape cards. Whether it's the Phoenix or whether it's Chainweb or whether it's, I mean, even some of the blue-white decks, they just gonna main deck the Think Twice. What is that card called? There is so many just cards you're happy to escape, and I think that actually hurts this deck quite a bit.
Oh, for sure. And the format's picked up on that really fast. That's, we're seeing these Ox end up in the sideboard. We're seeing the blue card that you just mentioned that I also do not remember the name of.
We'll get better as we do more podcasts again.
I've been trying to learn card names for 2 years. No promises that's ever going to happen.
Wait till we start doing limited and we just have to describe the card. We're going to be doing limited podcasts, Mikaela. Well, yeah, the 3/2 that does this. But no, I agree
stop
with what
attacking me.
You're a streamer, you get it. You know what's going on.
Yeah, we had that one card left in our deck that does that one thing. It could totally win us the game. We got this.
No, I agree. I think that the format they picked up on it relatively quickly. Like, okay, I've lost to this deck too much now. Chainwebs are going back in, or Phoenixes are going in the main, or Ox is going in the main. The number one deck. Let's talk about that really quick. Was the left struck B screen decks. The three that I highlighted were Gruul, Golgari, and Mono Green. And I don't know. Why don't you start? Why don't you tell us about what makes these decks both seem to have across the board high win percentages across events, across the board occupy a good percentage of the metagame. What is it about Love Struck Beast that's going on?
Okay, Love Struck Beast does it all. First off, we have an adventure card, so if you're a deck that's playing Edgewall Innkeeper, you automatically get some draws off that. You get to play a 1-drop. You have another 1-drop that you can play on turn 1. Will also not sacrifice your 3-drop slot. Also, a 5/5 coming to play on turn 3 is usually pretty good. It scares the control decks, first of all, and also what does Mono Red do about a 5/5? They just kind of stare at it and maybe hope they can trick them into blocking or play 2 removal spells on it, which just never feels good. So the card is super, super powerful. Like I said, with Innkeeper, it gets you get this value engine where you get to draw extra cards too. It's just a big body on the board that's either a great defensive tool or very threatening to your opponent.
Yeah, it's you mentioned adventures, and it's so funny too, because if you'd asked people, I don't know, 3 weeks ago what the best card in Standard, a lot of people would have said Giant, right? They would have said Stomp, and I think that is still true. Stomp is still quite amazing. Giant is still quite good. And Gruul gets both of those. But that being said, if you want more consistent mana, you can go with Mono Green. And if you go with Mono Green, you get, some really insane... Primal Might is way better than I thought it was going to be as a card. You get the green 3 mana, the green guy. You can just play Great Henchman. That deck also has a ton of value. Or if you want to go for Value Town, you can go with the Golgari deck. And all of these decks are able to, all of them, I mean Mono Green, Golgari, and Gruul, they're all able to be an aggressive deck. They're classic mid-range decks, right? They're able to be aggro against the controlling decks. They're able to be control against the aggro decks. And honestly, they're just able to value you out in some cases, which you don't always get out of these pretty aggressive mid-range decks.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Cards like Edgewall Innkeeper, Great Henge, just I don't know how it's so annoying when I see one of my opponents drop one of those, and I just know the whole game they're just gonna be drawing cards for the rest of the game, and I'm gonna have to keep up with all these cards that they're drawing. When I'm supposed to be that person drawing the cards. That's not their thing to be doing. That's my thing.
Yeah, I think it was 2 Saturdays ago we saw that Gruul deck win the challenge with moving the Great Henge to the main deck, and since
Mhm.
then, it's just become universally adopted for Gruul. It certainly, I mean, I think that when that card was spoiled or previewed, people were like, oh, well, that's a Magic card that exists. Um, but you know what I've actually had happen is that life gain on that card has come up against so many decks that I did not expect it. I mean, when you think about the size that you actually named the card earlier, the 1 mana black road can get,
Mhm.
it can be
Thieves Guild
difficult.
Enforcer, I believe.
Yeah,
Yep.
it can be difficult for that card. Actually, can be really good against Gruul, and just being able to make your creatures a little bit bigger, give them, give yourself a life buffer uh, when those Dimir decks are able to beat down against you is really powerful. In addition to just the fact that and a little bit extra life gain against things like Mono Red or Rakdos go a long way, especially when Rakdos is really trying to attack your life total with is it Croxa? Croxa?
Yes.
Yeah.
Either way.
But you actually had an interesting point about Golgari that I wanted to hear you talk about.
Yeah. So really, I could see Golgari just seeing an uptick in play if we see a decline in Yorion. That was actually one of the early decks that I tested against in the format for some reason. I don't know how I ended up on that. Don't ask. Um, but yeah, so the Yorion decks can like really punish Gruul quite a bit, or not Gruul. It can punish Golgari quite a bit. But if those are phasing out, it has really really good game versus these other decks where it can kind of take over that control position and just get tons of value. Can really deal with these other creature decks. Pelucranos is a house, and it can be very powerful, and it can play a really really great long game.
Yeah, I agree. I had when bannings first happened, all I did was play Lotus Cobra decks to start because I'm me, and I had one version that I was really enjoying that was Sultai. I had a Sultai version and an Abzan version, both playing Pluricanos, and that card is surprisingly busted. Like,
Mhm.
which is funny because when that card was spoiled, I was like, this seems kind of bad. And since playing with it, I'm like, oh, nope, this card actually just wipes an entire board and then comes back. You're really able to machine gun stuff down, and in a deck like Golgari, like you mentioned, where you're taking over that control game, having a 4 mana 6/6 in addition to something that can get you value throughout the game is really powerful.
Yeah, absolutely. And Golgari just it has a lot of tools against, a lot of the more aggressive decks like, Scavenging Ooze is great versus Rakdos. It has a spot versus Mono Red where that life gain and just getting a big creature on the board can really, really, really make a big impact. And also, I want to mention Vivian's in. So yeah, it's in all three of these green-based archetypes, and that card is very, very powerful versus your more controlling Yorion type decks, and where if you drop that, like you can get a creature, you still have a planeswalker on the board, and your opponent has to answer these two things, and
Yeah.
that can be really rough to go against.
So we've kind of covered all the top decks, but there is kind of a new up and comer that's coming across in a couple different ways, and that's I don't know. We just call them Ugin decks. I've seen mono blue. I've seen mono red. I've seen blue black. I've seen mono black. I think mono red was the most popular yesterday in the um, as far as like decks that were tweeted about. But what is this Ugin deck?
So I ran into this deck on ladder and had no idea what was going on. Um, the version I initially ran into is this mono red that was really based around artifacts. So it played the 3 mana Myr that produces 2 mana, and it played the Solemn Simulacrum to ramp, and I believe it played some artifact that I definitely don't know the name of, but it made like your colorless spells like produce, or your colorless mana produce more, I believe.
Okay.
Like I said, I was really
I
caught
know
off
what
guard
card you're
by this
talking about. I
deck.
don't know the name of that card either, but yeah.
um so, and also Maze My Tome. I had mentioned earlier Maze My Tome just is a very, very powerful card. Like just being able to draw a card when you need it, and sequence that into your plays can be extremely powerful, especially against decks like Rakdos. So, but yeah, the goal of this deck is to get to this Ugin as fast as possible and just take over the game with Ugin, because that's what Ugin does. So I've been on this. I've not played this deck. I've been against this deck from the Yorion side of things, and I've noticed it definitely does have game versus Yorion where you're kind of playing a similar game, and if you can get the Ugin out, it can be pretty detrimental to the unexpected player on the other side of the battlefield. And I know a Rakdos version made a debut in the MPL last week. I think it was on the MPL side of things. It might have been on Rivals. And it was listed as Rakdos mid-range, but really it was this style of deck where they're trying to ramp to Ugin, and they actually play Ironcrag Feet to play out I believe that would give you a turn 5 Ugin.
Yeah, that's the red 1 spell. It makes 7 mana. You can only play one more spell this turn. And yeah, we saw a ton, I mean at least like 4 or 5, but we saw a bunch of decks make day 2 of the Open playing just mono red with that card in Ugin. I think really solidifying red as the color, at least one of the colors to be using this archetype with. And I think that puts you at a pretty important core, right? You have, I would say, Mazemind Tome, Solemn Simulacrum, that card, Ugin, and then the side where you go from there. Because you're playing red, you're probably playing, Ox, I think is universally in most of these lists now, things like that. But it is a new developing archetype that I agree with you. I think it has a place in this format.
Yeah, it's really interesting. And I think, for those people who like really kind of off the wall, like decks, this definitely fits that feel. It's not quite the archetype that it doesn't really feel like a ramp deck. It kind of feels more like a combo deck.
Yeah. I almost wish that this deck played Perforos's Intervention when I see the big red versions. That card's the X and a red, deal double X to target creature or planeswalker, or make an X1 elemental. When looking at these decks, I thought about that card a couple times, so maybe something I try out. Is there anything we missed, Mikaela, on this format? I mean, we talked about so much that, like, I almost wish that we had talked about less decks by the end of it. I was like, oh man, I wanted to talk about this with Green White. I wanted to talk about this with other stuff. But is there anything you want to mention kind of before we wrap up?
There's a lot to say. I do want to bring up something I saw that was quite surprising from some updates that I saw on the day 1 of the Open, and that was the rise of Mono White.
Oh, that was a deck that not that one. Finish your thought, and then I have another one too.
Okay, I didn't really get to look deep into this, but I saw a surprising number of people getting through day 1 of the Open with Mono White and best of 1. And I think that's just something that needs to be on your radar. Maybe it's just a best of 1 deck. Maybe it was just something that happened to work for this day, but definitely worth being on the radar and being aware of that's out there.
Yeah, another one that's been popping up both on ladder and in leagues has actually been Knights. Holy crap, have I played against a lot of Knights decks recently. Do we know where this list came from? It's playing Embercleave and the white legendary artifact that makes Knights and gives +1/+1. I've never seen the deck before, and all of a sudden I played against it 3 times in like 2 days.
I'm not sure where it came from. I know Knights always seems to make a resurgence every once in a while. Probably will happen until Eldraine rotates out.
Sure. Well, I thought that deck was quite good and something that you will want to keep your eye out for as well. That is going to do it for kind of just a look into the standard metagame. Mikaela, I had a lot of fun today, and I am so excited for the future of this show. One, I'm all really excited to talk about Limited. I'm really excited to talk about Historic, and just break down and help players get Mythic on Arena, talk to some Mythic players, and I'm really excited for you to kind of be on this new podcast journey with me.
I'm excited to be here. I'm excited for all the work that's going to go into the each week too. Like it's really exciting just to like dive deep into these formats and dive deep into what's going to matter for your ladder climb.
Yeah. Well, thank you everybody so much for listening. Don't forget to hit that like button, hit that subscribe button if you're watching on YouTube. If you're listening on a podcast platform, give us a review. It's actually really helpful for the show, things like that. And don't forget to check out our sponsor at puremtgo.com. Once again, Mikaela, thank you. And we'll see everybody next week for another brand new episode of Arena Mythic Cast.